Hello there, and welcome to a brand new season of the Beat Burnout podcast with me, Dr. Claire Ashley. For those of you that don't know me, I'm a doctor, I'm a burnout survivor and expert, and you might have noticed that the name of the podcast has changed. Essentially, what I'm going to be doing on the podcast is exactly the same as I have been in the first two seasons, which is talking about my previous experience with burnout, talking about all the evidence-based things that you need to know, all the strategies that you need to know to both prevent burnout from happening, how to recognize it, and how to manage it if it happens to you. Now, the reason why I've changed the name is because what I'm doing is I'm just creating a brand where everything that I do is going to be brought under the same brand. So my subscription box, for instance, is called Do Yourself No Harm. That's going to become the Beat Burnout subscription box. My website is www.beatburnout.co.uk. So it's all going to be under the same umbrella, basically. So it's just to make sure that there's consistency between the platforms that I'm using. But yeah, as I said, nothing much is going to be changing. It's still going to be me talking about my experiences, drawing not just on my own lived experience, but also my years and years of experience as a medical practitioner, and also drawing on my background in neuroscience as well. So I have a first class honours degree in neuroscience. So I occupy a very, very unique space when it comes to talking about burnout, bridging, my lived experience with my clinical experience. This season, I'm delighted to have invited on some guests. So the last season was just me talking to camera because I found it so much easier to do that than to get guests on, because life is crazy. Life is really chaotic at the moment. And it was just really a little bit more straightforward for me to be able to do that. But this time around, I have invited some guests on. And what I'm planning to do is to do a combination of me just talking about my experiences and some hot topics to do with burnout, and also getting some guests on. So for the first episode of this season, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Katya Miles, who is a GP and occupational health doctor turned wellbeing trainer, team and careers coach, and a specialist in workplace wellbeing. The subject of today's podcast is all about how to return to work well after burnout. And there are several reasons why I've done this. Firstly, it's something that I get asked about a lot, and increasingly I'm asked a lot about how to deal with recurrent burnout. And, I think if you go back to work and you don't do it right, if you don't make changes, if you don't get it right, if you go back into the fire, you are just going to burn out again. And it's really important that you put steps in place and changes in place so that when you go back to work, that you're really protected against that happening again. But it's also really, really hard to make those changes. It's hard to know what changes to make. It's hard to know how to ask for it. It's really difficult to advocate for yourself. And it's really tricky, especially if you're going back into the same environment that burnt you out in the first place. How do you know that you're well enough to return? How can you make that transition back into work as easy as possible? So I get asked about it a lot, and I think there's still quite a gap in our knowledge about what it is that we need to do to return to work well safely. And do you know what? I've done it wrong. I'll fully put my hands up and say this is something that I have struggled with myself. I have been very open about my own burnout journey, and those of you that have been following me for a while will know that I have slid into burnout twice. The second time around, I caught myself sooner. Luckily, I wasn't in a full burnout crisis. But that second slide into burnout was a trigger for me to go back and think, what didn't I do the first time around? Where do I need to go and do the deep work to make sure that I can continue to work and that I can continue to stay well? And I've learned a lot on that journey that I really, really want to share with you guys. And in fact, I think this is such an important issue that I've actually made it a bonus module in my flagship course, my Beat Burnout Recovery course, which is available to purchase on my Teachable School. I'll put the link in the notes to the show. I've recorded an entire module on how to do this well, because it's so hard to go back to work and stay well after burnout. So it's really great to have Katya join me for this podcast. So Katya, as I said, she's previously a GP, she's now an occupational health doctor, and she has been through burnout herself. And having done that, what she's done is she's resolved to empower caring professionals to avoid the mistakes she made and thrive in work. Hello, that sounds very similar to my own journey. This passion drove her to set up the Working Well Doctor, where she uses her clinical and academic expertise along with her personal experience to deliver inspiring coaching and training programs for overstretched professionals. She has worked at the Mayo Clinic, USA, and in the UK as a GP for both civilians and the armed forces, as well as in occupational health. She currently works across several roles across the Working Well Doctor. She's head of training at the Joyful Doctors and a Shapes Toolkit trainer. She loves a good natter on a podcast and writes for the British Medical Journal and Medic Footprints, and is often found sharing ideas in her regular email newsletter, Thrive Well News. I've actually signed up to Katya's newsletter via LinkedIn, and it's a real joy to receive her emails in my inbox through LinkedIn. So yeah, I definitely recommend signing up to her email newsletter for her incredible and wonderful insights. In terms of today's podcast, we are going to be covering why you need time off in burnout, and in particular touching on the impact of guilt and presenteeism. What things you need to do to prepare yourself to return to work after burnout. And in particular covering, who do you need to talk to or reach out to in order to help you on your return to work. We're going to be covering what adjustments or changes you might need to return to work well. And we'll be covering this both thinking about the short term and the long term too. And we'll also be talking about what a realistic return to work both looks and feels like. Really hope you enjoy this podcast. I think it's going to be helpful for so many of you. If you enjoy it, please hit like and subscribe. And remember that Katya has a retreat coming up soon in person. So I really recommend that you go and have a look at that because it looks absolutely fantastic. Enjoy today's podcast. Good morning and welcome to the podcast today, Katya. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
You're very welcome. So do you just briefly want to introduce yourself and what it is that you do, Katya?
Well, I'm Katya. Lovely to meet you. For those who know me through my work, I am the Working Well Doctor. So I am a careers coach and wellbeing trainer, and my passion is helping healthcare and high stress professionals avoid burnout and thrive in work they love. And that is a little bit like Claire, because I'm a burnout survivor, or whatever phrase we want to use. I've journeyed through burnout and it was rubbish. And there was some stuff I learned. And if I wish I had known that at the time, really want to support others to avoid some of those mistakes I made. And that's really what drives me to do what I do now, which is career coaching and training. I used to be a GP and occupational health doctor, but I don't work clinically anymore.
Lovely. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I think something you touched on there is that so many of us in this space that are doing this kind of work have lived through burnout and have personal experience. And because we know just how awful it is, we really empathize, but we also know what it takes to get out of it. And there's always hope. Today we are going to be talking about returning to work after a period of sick leave, specifically in burnout, aren't we? So let's open the conversation by talking about why it is that you need time off work with burnout in the first place.
I think it's kind of a broader question than it appears, actually, because the first thing is what is burnout? People use that phrase a lot. Like we were saying before the podcast started, I think people use the word burnout more than they did maybe 2 to 3, 5 years ago. So when I had burnout, looking back, I probably had fully fledged burnout that meets the WHO criteria. But at the time, that word wasn't really used. And actually, I think burnout wasn't even added and described as a phenomenon until I think it might be 2019. Don't quote me on that, but I think it's around that time. So not that long ago, really. So before that time, people were probably having the same experience, but there was no label. And I think the labels can be constraining. But in this case, I find that burnout has actually maybe been, in my view, just a personal view, helpful, because it's a word people seem to be comfortable to use, which is great, right? It reduces stigma. It allows more people to have conversations about how they feel. And in my view, that's really important to getting help and getting through this. So as you probably know, Claire's probably mentioned on previous podcasts, the official definition of burnout, you need to feel exhausted. It's not just after a feeling tired on a Friday, but better on a Monday. That's feeling exhausted despite time off, having a reduced or increased mental distance from your work, however that manifests in you as an individual. Some people might feel that cynicism or detached or whatever. And then the third thing is poor performance. And often in a conscientious professionals, I know most of you out there are those kind of folk, often that is the last thing to be seen. You as an individual will have known that you've been tired and feeling that mental distance for a while, but you've been working really hard to cover that up, and not in a deceitful way, but just in a genuine way to make up for that. And then at some point you just run out of steam, because we're all humans and we have limits. And that's when performance declines, and that's no good for you. It's no good for people around you. And that's a really tricky space to be in. And the other thing about burnout by this definition is it's occupational. So under this definition, you can't be burnt out from life. You can only be burnt out from work. So it's not the same as anxiety, depression, and so forth. So again, not giving any medical advice here, because I'm just here as a trainer and a coach, but just to think about what's going on for you, really, whether or not you meet that list we've just discussed, or is it something different, which is fine. It's really important just to have a word that you can use to label the fact you're finding things difficult, and to use that word to seek help. And if you need time off, as we're talking about here, to have that time off. So I think that's really just to maybe some thoughts to reflect upon if you're struggling. What's going on for me? Are you functioning for you, for the people around you, your clients or patients, whatever you might be doing in your work, and for your team as well? And also, are you delivering at the level that you would like to be delivering at? And there's a lot of people who feel really guilty. I'd say a huge amount. And also, I don't know about you, Claire, if you'd agree, but sometimes I feel, again, a personal view, I feel that people who are in caring professions tend to care, right? Which is great. But then along with that often comes that feeling of guilt. So just to sort of name that and just say, if you're feeling guilty, it probably just means you care. Psychopaths don't feel guilt. So it's not bad to feel guilty. It means you care. But sort of bear that in mind when you're thinking about what's going on for you, and be also that sense of, if we're at work and we're not really firing on all cylinders, is that great for us or the people around us? So bear those things in mind. But the most important thing, if that happens, is to get help, get professional help. So this is a podcast, we're talking in general themes. There's no specific advice we can give, medical or otherwise, but there are really important people who can help you. Your GP, especially if they've got a special interest in occupational health, and there's often people, especially through large organizations, you can get an occupational health doctor or advisor, and they are excellent folk to connect with.
Lovely. I mean, one of the things that you mentioned there was, obviously when it comes to taking time off work, I think when it comes to burnout, if you tick all three criteria, you've reached the point, haven't you, where a little bit of time off isn't going to cut the mustard. And we were discussing before we started recording about how quite often there is this misconception, perhaps misplaced hope, that having a couple of weeks off work is going to be enough to kind of reset things and allow you to recover and then go back to work well. But actually, I think in reality, this isn't the case. Can you tell me a little bit about your experiences in working with your clients who have been on sick leave with burnout? How long do they need to take off, really?
It's interesting, that, isn't it? So I think that really depends on the individual. And that's really why one thing I do now a lot is talk about reflecting and giving yourself permission to really notice how you're feeling. Because your external performance can be measured by others, but the other things, how you're feeling in yourself, they're really, nobody looking in can really see, especially if you're a conscientious person. So I really think it does, there's a great benefit from taking some time to reflect. And we were talking about this earlier, weren't we? Whether it's do some creative writing, or just go for a run, or talk to a friend, or a professional, so counselors and coaches are really helpful people to have in your life around this time. And that's one reason why I do career coaching along with the wellbeing training, because I do think that really helps. So there's lots of people that I think you can build a network of people who support you. But I think the key part of this is actually giving yourself permission to access these things. So knowing the stuff is helpful. And one of the reasons I ended up in burnout, in fact, the main reason was I knew the stuff we're talking about. I don't know as much as I know now, but I knew a fair bit. I had a diploma in occupational health, but still I wasn't able to access the tools I needed. And some of them were external and some of them were internal. And that's because I just didn't give myself permission. That got back to guilt that we just talked about. So I think the key thing in all of this is actually that permission piece, especially if you're a conscientious professional. It's okay to not be okay. It's okay to not be doing well, and it's okay to get help. And then within that, you can then start to unpick the questions about how am I doing, and how long am I going to need. Sometimes, like you were saying, it does take longer. And it can, depending on where you're at, depending on whether or not you have burnout that meets the full criteria, you might need longer off. If you have burnout that doesn't meet those criteria, it might be a shorter term stress related thing, or another issue. You might have had something else going on that's just tipped your capacity, like a bereavement or something else in life that's happened. You a shorter time might be okay, but I do think that the key to answering that is a bit more time and permission to reflect on what's going on, and then noticing and naming how you're feeling. Because again, I think we're not great in that. Many healthcare professionals are really good at thinking about other people. We struggle a bit to notice and name how we're feeling. It was really interesting work done by Brené Brown. I think, don't quote me, but I think they asked some people, adults, to name some feelings like that they're feeling rather than others, and they came up with 3: happy, sad, and angry. And there's like so many more human emotions in the world. A book called Atlas of the Heart, which has all these different emotions, and I think just understanding even that kind of quite entry level vocabulary about how we feel is really important, actually. So yeah, I guess that's a long way of hopefully addressing.
So basically what you're saying, it's down to the individual, how severe their burnout is, and at what stage of their burnout they're at as well. But it's more likely to be several weeks, if not months, rather than a short period of time off work, isn't it? And I just wanted to touch on, we talked a little bit about the guilt and shame that goes with burnout, isn't it? And particularly if you are in a caring profession, or if you're a highly conscientious individual, which so many of us with burnout are, that then feeds into behaviors that I think that keep you longer at work than perhaps you should spend. So quite often we see in healthcare professionals is this problem of presenteeism, isn't it? So do you just want to briefly talk about what that is, Katya, and how that affects us in burnout?
Yeah, that's interesting. We touched on that earlier, didn't we? So I think, again, don't quote me the official definition, but the unofficial off-the-cuff definition is when you're at work when maybe it's not the best place for you to be, for you or for the people around you. And sometimes others looking in might find that easier to see, and it might be hard for us to see in ourselves because we're very much, like we just said already, feeling guilty. Don't want to let people down. But also, I think it's important to name this when we're in the current situation. There's a huge amount of actual real demand, especially in teaching. I know some of your listeners are teachers, and in healthcare. It's huge. We all know there are strikes going on in the UK at the moment. There are genuine morale issues. There's a lot of people, members of staff, who are off with stress or burnout, whatever you want to call it. And there's huge demand. So there's also a genuinely huge demand. There's probably so it is in that context, it is even harder to take time, and it's less and less likely when the demands are high that people around you are going to say, off you go, I give you with open arms, I give you carve out this afternoon and say go and take a coffee break, and it's not these people on your team members aren't kind or good people. It's just that there are demands that are profound at the moment. So I think that is really important to acknowledge as well, and it's really not an easy time. But as we all know, and as we can see from the rates of burnout, and we know from personal experience, that the answer can't be you just stay forever, because I think if we could, we would. It's just that there are ways for staying forever, but that involves strategies to keep yourself thriving and sustain yourself. But if we all have limits, and if we push beyond those limits, then most humans can't. I mean, that is just something to bear in mind as well when we're thinking about these themes.
I think you're absolutely right. No one is going to give you permission to go off sick, are they? Your teammates are going to turn around, unless you're in a crisis and you can't physically be at work. No one's going to say to you, take these preemptive measures. We're not given that permission, are we, to go and do those things?
Tricky. Yeah, it's tricky. I think that gets to leadership as well, and management. I think there are really good managers out there, and I think a good line manager really protects you from a lot of stuff coming above, and almost that's the role of a manager. And then who protects them is a second question, and their support. So bearing in mind they're humans as well. So there's that piece. So I still think I have seen in the work I do, I go into lots of practice, especially in general practice. There are some practices which are I've got a great team, and they often have a good leader who is able to do that thing where they give permission, and they have ways of maintaining themselves, whether it's with peer support or other resources. And again, in hospitals, that happens, and I know in education as well. But there are other pockets where the managers, maybe they're struggling and having burnout. This is judgment on any individual. But there are pockets, and if that structure isn't in place, then that permission for you to take the time you need is less. And I think there's something about modeling as well. So if your manager is able to do that for themselves, and they set the culture in the team saying, we are going to have that away day, we are going to help each other leave on time, we are going to carve out that team coffee break, that makes a massive difference for teams. So I think it depends. It's patchy. There's places where it's done really well even now, and that's wonderful. And there's places where those kind of that culture isn't so prevalent. I guess those are my
and I think when you're working in a dysfunctional workplace, albeit perhaps with some very lovely, kind colleagues, that's when I think you're at risk, isn't it? Because we know that good teams are protective against burnout, isn't it? Okay, so let's imagine now that you have had some time off sick with your burnout, and you're at home and you're recovering, and you're starting to feel a little bit better. You're starting to engage in some good health behaviors, getting decent sleep, eating nutritiously, doing some movement, getting some daylight. Your mood is starting to pick up a little bit, and you're starting to think, when am I going to go back to work, and how am I going to do it? What sort of things do you need to do to prepare yourself to return to work, and how do you know that it's the right time as well?
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So some of that's individual, isn't it? So the exact time for you to go back to work depends on a lot of factors, individual factors and workplace factors. So that's really, that's also where you need to get your individual advice from your GP and your occupational health doctor. And you need, like many things, you need to keep an eye on it, let's start planning this and then see how you go. And if when the time comes, is that the right time? So there's that piece. I think that the broader answer to your question is to keep that connection with the people around you, both and that gets back to stigma. So you've got to find, it's helpful to find a way to feel comfortable saying what's going on. You don't necessarily have to tell everybody at work the label for the time you've been off, but people will know you've been off. I do workshops for people returning to work after parental leave, and actually it does include people returning for non-parental leave as well. So I think I talk about this a lot in these Love Your Return to Work workshops. So I think there's something about finding a way of planning what to say to the people you're returning with, whatever it is. If it's like, I've had a baby, that's kind of easy. In general, people will have noticed usually that you're pregnant. And if it's not for that reason, then you choose what works for you, what feels authentic and comfortable for you to share. And then I think it's really important to actually keep in touch with the team early. So I think something I see with people on parental leave is that they don't, sometimes, I know, fair enough, they've got a baby and there's different headspace and it's very busy. They don't really think about returning to work until just before they go back. So I'd say the main thing to do is if it's possible, to keep in touch. They actually are keep in touch days in the NHS called kit days. You can use them for courses and so on, which is amazing. But you can also use them just for literally keeping in touch, like going in and having a coffee. So building those connections, maintaining those relationships. And also, if you've been away for a while, some relationships might have changed, right? Some team members might have changed, or the way people work might have changed, or the systems might have changed. The biggest example of that recently was with COVID, right? People went on maternity leave and they came back in lockdown and they were like, oh my God, everything's virtual. Massive system change to accommodate aside from anything else. So I think just acknowledging that there's other changes going on while you're away and you're coming back and it'll be a bit different. So just planning for that, allowing for that, and understanding that change can feel quite disruptive. So giving us and our team's time. Then there's the admin piece. For many of us working in the NHS will know that it's a slow moving beast. The bureaucracy in the NHS is profound. You can have profound bureaucracy. So you've got to allow time for just the wheels to turn and all the forms to be filled in and all that. And if you are coming back with a different work pattern, for example, somebody coming back to work after parental leave may often want to be working different hours. That takes a lot of planning. So you've got to work out what you need, work out how to say it, overcome that permission and guilt and all those things before you even get in the room and have the conversation, often with your line manager or training supervisor or whoever. And then you've got a negotiation. Does what you need fit with the team? How does that jigsaw puzzle fit? Yeah. And again, that's where if you're returning when it's not parental leave for another reason, it's really helpful to have occupational health advice for those conversations. I think that's really important. So I would definitely say do that. And then again, keep that network that you've got, the official support network, your GP, your occupational health doctor. If you're a professional, is there a professional group? If you're a trainee, is there a trainee group? If you're a new parent, is there a new parent group? If you've had a health condition, is there a group for that? So give yourself peer support both within and outside work, and acknowledge this is a change, and change takes time. It doesn't feel easy, and just allowing that time. So I think those are some of the key themes, I'd say.
Yeah. I think one of the other things about returning to work after burnout is I think you have to have realistic expectations about the fact that you're probably not going to have the same amount of stamina when you go back physically. So certainly for myself, I don't know if you experienced this, Katya, but my fatigue was very, very significant on return, like on working, and actually continues to be, even though I'm several years down the line now. But also how much emotional and mental capacity you have. And it's a very vulnerable time, isn't it? Preparing to go back to work, knowing that work is really the cause of your problems. So this is a really difficult question. I do apologize, but how can you advocate for yourself? How can you protect yourself in that really, really vulnerable transition time?
I love it.
Boom. Sorry.
I'll preface this by saying I reserve the right to not answer. I think you've answered it, actually. I've actually got a slide on my return to work slide set, which is in front of me here, and it actually says that. It says advocate for yourself. So I think it really is about that, and that gets right back to permission, not feeling so guilty, saying, okay, for myself, for my one, as far as we know, one life on the planet, my work, for the people I work with, and for the people outside of work, this matters. So therefore it is okay, and to take that time to work out what you need and to say that is really helpful. Now, whether or not you get it exactly, that's about the fit between the job and the work, but that's life. Life is full of negotiations, and I think it's important to be prepared to have those negotiations and realize that most managers are not horrible people. They're doing their best. They may have their own issues that you may or may not know about. And that's really why I do what I do, actually. That's why I have the career coaching element, because sometimes it's helpful to have a coach and to think about your options more broadly along with this process, because it can be hard to work out what you want, and then it can be hard to say that. And then you might need to negotiate. You might need to work out, does this fit with me? What are the financial options? All of those implications, and really allowing ourselves to think more broadly and say, okay, what is the type of work that will work for me? So when we're just coming back to work for whatever reason, initially it's like, okay, I did this job, I left it, and I'm going to come straight back. And parental leave being a good example, and sick leave can be another one, where you're actually coming back, my needs have changed. Yeah. So I need to articulate those needs, and having an occupational health professional to help me with that is really helpful. And on a personal level, having a coach to help me can be helpful with that. And then how am I going to say it? Often you can write it down, whether it's in an email or just write down some notes that you use to speak. And again, the time to allow those conversations, because it is really a conversation, which might take time. People might not know. You might say, oh, I've got a baby now, can I reduce my hours? Your line manager might literally genuinely just, I don't know what's possible. I just need to go work it out. And if it's in a big organization, it might not be them, it might be HR to consider. So I think that's really important. Just to think it through and speak, and then allow time for that negotiation.
I mean, I think when you go back to work after burnout, you do have to have some changes in place. Otherwise, you go back into the fire, you're going to burn out again. But you're right, it is a negotiation, and it has to be something that you feel comfortable with and that your employer also feels comfortable with. And that can be tricky. It can involve compromise, can't it?
Definitely. And I talk a lot about change in the workshops I run, because I think there's a lot of changes here. There's changes for you in your mindset, changes for your needs, then the change in your approach to having these conversations. And I'd say the most successful approach would be to have a strategy for your home, like we talked about, your whole self, and you touched on this: nutrition, diet, exercise. Have that as a strategy. Okay, that has to continue. That can't stop the minute you go back to work. So how am I going to weave that in? And then here's my job. And do the hours, does the role fit me? What are the financial consequences of that? So all of those things need to be in place. And then the manager is going to come with their similar-ish, this is what the team needs, this is what's going on. And just sort of approaching it in a collaborative way, I think, is really helpful. That gets back to the relationships, right? That's why it's helpful to have had the coffee with them on your kit day, because you're building a relationship for this conversation that you might have down the line.
What if your relationship with your manager is tricky?
That's one I might just reserve the answer, the thingy not. I think the answer is it's tricky then, isn't it? These are not things. I think it's just a question of, I think you just have to do your best. You'd probably need to take that on an individual case-by-case basis. Sorry, background.
I guess sometimes that can be something that might lead you to a decision about whether or not that workplace and that particular department or team is the right place for you, realistically, if you're going to struggle to build those good relationships to go back to allow you to stay well when you return. But I think that it's an added layer of complexity at a time when you're very vulnerable. Makes it really, really difficult, doesn't it, to
I think
to plan return.
And I think being alive to that and saying, not everybody's a fluffy bunny, and we aren't all gonna not every relationship will be a dreamy relationship in life or in work. I think just if that happens, then that's where I think having a coach is really helpful, because again, this isn't a medical problem. Your GP and occupational health doctor may be able to help, but actually some of this is about you, your relationships, your choices. You always have a choice. What are your choices in this situation with the great collaborative manager? What are your choices in this situation with the manager who's not so collaborative? And just really bearing in mind you always have a choice, and having some support from maybe a coach if that feels right for you.
So you've reminded me that I've actually written an ABCDE of advocating for yourself and change when you're burnt out. So I'm just going to share that if you're happy with that, Katya.
Go on.
We're medics, so we love a little mnemonic, don't we? We all love our ABCs. So A stands for ask for change, but if you can propose a solution, because change that's always going to be better received than if you go just complaining about a problem that but without offering anything that's going to help the person that needs to then problem solve for you. And also audit trail, get it in writing if you can as well, if you're asking for changes. B is be in a group. That's less about returning to work after burnout, but that's about if you want change to happen at work, if you're in a group of peers and colleagues who want the same change, if you go and ask for change together, that's far more powerful than individuals going and asking for change. And also believe that you are worthy of change. The C is care, so get support from your peers and loved ones outside of work. D is debrief with your manager, so that's asking for measurable outcomes and plans reviews of the changes and outcomes. So I think that is applicable after you return to work. You are going to need to have periodic reviews to make sure that you're staying well and that the changes also are being sustained, because that's another thing that I've come across in the NHS. People might say, yes, we'll change these things for you, but very quickly, quite often things start to slide without having those planned reviews in place, that accountability. And the E stands for energy. So that's about respecting your burnout. And, if you're early on in your recovery, if your burnout scores are still very high, if you tick all of those three domains in the definition, then you have to go for low hanging fruit, or things that are easy to change, I think, and small, reasonable adjustments at work. Because if you don't go for that, if you go for the big stuff that is going to require a lot of energy and be harder to actually bring about, then you're just going to be frustrated that you can't do it, and then that's going to fuel your burnout again, isn't it? So
interesting. There's a couple. I think I'm just trying to think. So I think we've covered most of it. That's a lovely mnemonic. I think we've covered most of it in our chat prior to the mnemonic. But I think your point about review is really helpful. I was going to mention that. I think there's 2 points to that. One is you as an individual need to check in with yourself. How am I actually doing? I thought it would be like X. Reality is Y. Great example with kids is you go back and you have this great contingency based on the fact your kid sleeps through the night, they're never ill. And then you get back to work within 6 weeks or 6 days, they're up at night, they're unsettled because you're back at work. You have a nursery or other child provider. Your kid has a fever. Their policy is we don't have a kid with a fever. And you're like, okay, so now I need a contingency. And do I have a contingency? Some of us do, some of us don't. So that's an example from parental leave, but similar things can happen with burnout. So that's that. And I do also think there's something there about debriefing with your manager. I think, again, it gets back to the individual. Some managers are great. And what you described when you did your ABCD was a manager who wasn't so great. And this kind of thing, this notion where things slide and people are really keen to have you back and they'll say stuff and they intend it and then things slip. So that's really about, again, managers. I've met really good managers. That's about management, discipline, systems and good leadership. And that the leader standing back and going, I need to sustain this system. Otherwise this employee or team member won't do so well. So again, great managers can do that really well, and managers who aren't who maybe not so familiar would maybe struggle with that. So I think that can be done really well, and I've seen it done really well. And again, like you said, in other times it can't. So I think and I think accountability is part of that. And that works best when the whole team has that culture, rather than you and this individual manager having this conversation saying, no, this is our team culture. We are open, we have these plans, we articulate them, and we have a friendly collaborative where we keep each other accountable. And we know that we kind of got that culture of having each other's backs, can be really helpful, rather than this sense of kind of you're the victim and there's a persecutor, and that kind of dynamic can be really
it's so hard not to fall into that pattern of thinking and take that role when you're burnt out, isn't it? I've definitely experienced, I've definitely felt the victim with my burnout 100%, and a lot of anger goes along with that as well.
And I think naming that is really important. Naming your anger. You don't have to name it like in a way, but you don't even have to say it in any workplace environment, but at home in your personal time, I feel angry. That, as Brené Brown would say, back to the Atlas of the Heart book, plug for her there, not getting any royalties. It's a human emotion, right? It's a normal, healthy emotion. It tells us there's a boundary that's being crossed. And actually, if we acknowledge that, there's lots of actions we can take to address that. Back to advocacy. Only some of them have to be aggressive ones. There can be lots of assertive ones that can be really helpful. And I talk in other workshops I run about just saying, if you're feeling angry, then there are healthy ways to process that emotion, whether it's, we talked about this before, kickboxing or going for a run or whatever. Lots of healthy ways to manage that, and then also acknowledge, okay, there's something here I need to change. That involves a conversation. So really trying to get out of any sort of sense of being a victim, and really feeling, okay, I'm a catalyst here. I'm an agent. I can make change happen. This is an opportunity here to change for me, the system, and I have choice, right? There are always choices. They may not always be easy or palatable, but they are choices. And sort of really being alive to that as well when we look forward. And then having your finances in good order, so that gives you financial flex, allows you to think more broadly about what your choices are. I think that's something all medics focus on, that part, but knowing that, or building up some kind of way to manage your finances gives you flex.
And I think the other thing to say about that is you might want to leave your job, for instance, or go off and train in something else, but your finances don't currently allow it. You can, accepting that doesn't mean you don't have to sit back and wallow in self-pity. You can still make a plan. You can think, where do I want to be in a year's time? Where do I want to be in 2 years' time, 10 years' time? And start working towards it, because if you know that you're moving towards it, albeit slowly and incrementally, because that's real life, then you'll feel better than just sitting back and going, I don't have any control over this. And because you'll just slide back into feeling rubbish again, won't you?
I totally agree with that. I think there's a big link there. And it's definitely something I didn't think about this earlier on, and it makes you feel quite hemmed in. I feel like you
claustrophobic. You
always do have choices, but they're not always easy or palatable, but they are choices. And just working out what's the best of these options in front of us. They might not be the perfect, but what's the best option?
I think something that I've found very helpful in my recovery is, if I'm faced with a decision or a choice that, as you say, the choices feel uncomfortable or unpalatable in the present moment, is to go back to what my values are and what it is that I'm motivated by and what makes me feel good, and making a decision in line with those values is really, really important. So I've done a lot of work on this post burnout. As medics, you'll understand this, Katya, you don't get taught anything about how to make decisions based on your values, but actually, if you want to be happy, we make decisions based on, I want to be a consultant, I want to be a GP, I want to be an XYZ, whatever it is. And actually, it's more about, is what you're deciding going to give you the life that you want to live, and is it in alignment with the things that you hold deeply personally to be meaningful? And
Yeah.
I think if you're struggling with decision making, I think it's helpful to go back to that as well. And particularly if you're returning to work and you can't have the changes that you want, what is going to feel most comfortable to you in this present time?
Yeah, I love that. That's actually often where I start with my career coaching. I start with
Mm-hmm.
I start with this just a values exercise. I think,
Yeah.
and often, I mean, I think often we did think about our values when we went into medicine, if we're talking to medics or
Yes.
whoever at the beginning, or social workers. Yeah, before we started on a career path, we'd have thought we care, we want to contribute, we want to whatever,
Yeah.
something interesting. Money would have been there somewhere, but or maybe not at the very top.
Yeah.
People at the very top might have gone into finance or so on. And revisiting those, and like you said, are they the same or have they changed? And if we've had a big life event, whether it's people returning from parental leave or illness or burnout, those are or can feel like really big life events, and those are good opportunities actually to review. So again, see this as an opportunity. Where's the silver lining here? One of the silver linings is things feel up in the air. Okay, fine, I can be in control of how they land. And I think values are a very helpful guide. I think that's a really, really good point. And acknowledging that some of your values might not be different, might not be the same as your teammates. But if you're in a vocation, often you might have aligned values. So even though you might find this one conversation with your manager tricky, just sort of standing back and going, okay, we're all ultimately in the same boat. We all ultimately have similar values, and just using that as a common thread can be helpful as well, I find. So you find that commonality and within the conversations you're having with people.
I think that's a really important thing to remember, especially if you're having a difficult relationship with your manager, is to remind yourself if the goals of the organization or the company that you work for or your immediate peers and colleagues are aligned, their values are aligned with yours, then actually I think sometimes that can be enough to make going back to work an easier process, isn't it? Okay.
Yeah, and articulating that to each other as well. So for both of you,
really important. So now that we're having a conversation with work about going back, realistically, what reasonable adjustments do people sometimes need to consider when they're going back? And what does a realistic return to work look and feel like from your perspective?
I think I'm going to say that's one for the individual. That really depends. I really, it depends. So I think you just have a chat. It's important to think about reasonable adjustments, but I would say that really depends on the individual and the work. So that's where I would definitely say your GP and your occupational health doctor need to give you some support. And actually back to the stuff we've just said, your values, your plans, what you need is going to be a large part of discussing those reasonable adjustments. And your sense of, like you were just saying, you had fatigue issues. So that's your individual response and how that affects you. So I think that's really for the individual.
Yeah. And that's, as you said, that's a conversation you can have with the professionals who will understand the nature of the work and know from their clinical knowledge what's going to work long term for you and what isn't it?
And the workplace as well, they're all really different even within one profession. So I think that's really
So Katya, when it comes to returning to work, how or when do you know that the changes that you've made are working?
That's a good question, isn't it? I think I would open that up to the audience, actually, if you are listening. I think that's a really good question for us to reflect on for ourselves. And if this was a coaching session, I'd actually say that back to the client, say, well, what do you think? What would work for you? So I think, and I think answering that question for yourself is actually a really empowering question. What does it look like for me? Did the job I left look like the right job and it was just a bit much? Or actually, is this not the right fit? You know, have my circumstances changed, whether it's new baby or new values or adjusting values, or have I got a health condition that now has, some ongoing needs? So I think that's a really good one. It's a really powerful question, and working out what that answer is for you is going to really give you some insight, I'd say. And I'd say if it's not immediately apparent, we talked about stuff before, journaling or working with a coach, I think that's really helpful. And I think it's important to think about that with yourself, or not, I was going to say by yourself, but if you're with a coach, you wouldn't be by yourself, but for yourself. So answer that for yourself, and then go and have the conversation with the manager and the ongoing briefs, with that kind of sense in yourself of what feels right for you. And some people are going to go slot right back in and go, yeah, this job was great. Oh, and it's okay. Now I'm settled back in. And other people are going to find that that's not the case. And I think, if you get a job that fits you, it can feel really good. The job person fit can be a lovely thing, and it can help you thrive. And sort of trying to keep your antennae out for what that looks and feels like, and it can be really important as we sort of design our careers. Just to sort of think about your career as a longer term path, and you're kind of adjusting yourself as you go.
Yeah, it's more of an evolutionary process, isn't it? Rather than thinking, I want to get to XYZ and it's a straight line getting from where you are to where you want to be. It's about enjoying the journey, I think, as well, isn't it?
Yeah. I really do. And I don't know about teaching, but in medicine, it's can feel very not that way. So you go, you qualify, or in fact, even before you qualify, there's even from school, you do certain, if you're going to have a very traditional path, you're told what A levels to do because you want to be a doctor. So do these science A levels, then get these grades, then go to this set of universities to do this degree, where it's very prescribed. And of course, the knowledge base of medicine does require that, and some of the communication consultation skills. So I'm not saying that's bad, but there's an implication there that when you then exit as a doctor, you will then continue on these roles, and most training pathways are quite structured. Again, it's very important that people learn this set of skills to be a surgeon, to be a GP. You've got to acquire certain skills. Amazing. And if that works for you, amazing. But if it doesn't work for you, then thinking, okay, how am I going to flex this? And actually, lots of people I see when in career coaching have actually done that journey, and they've got to the end of they are the consultant, the GP, and they're like, oh, now what? Oh, it doesn't quite feel like I thought it would. And I don't have any rails anymore, these sort of guardrails that have kind of, for the past 10, however many years, have given me sort of structure for my career path. And that can feel quite daunting, but it's also a great opportunity, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And I think what that takes us very nicely to, in a full circle way, is what we said at the start of the podcast, which is that there is so much opportunity, there is so much hope after your burnout with returning to work, and your post-burnout career might look and feel very different to the pre-burnout career that you had hoped or expected to have. The guardrails have come off. That can feel scary, but it's also very empowering, and there is so much opportunity. You just have to be recovered enough to recognize that and to feel like you have the capacity to make those changes. But there's always hope, and actually your life might end up immensely better as a result of what you've gone through,
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And that's what Claire and I are here to help you with that. That's what we're doing. That's what we're here for, right? That's why we do what we do, for that reason. Because it's not cookie cutter, is it? Everybody's different, and that's the joy of it. We're all different, and just and working that out for ourselves and those around us is a really helpful thing. And something I didn't say, actually, just reflecting on stuff I was going to say. One other thing I think in the midst of all of this is to allow yourself to take breaks, because all this stuff requires a bit of reflection. And I often do lots of workshops where people are really busy. So one thing I've written a couple of newsletters on this, and I talk about this in my workshops, is take a break. The breaks can be anything from like a mini break between patients, 3 deep breaths if you're a GP between one patient and the next, to giving yourself permission to take, not do any work at the weekend, that kind of just allowing yourself to have boundaries during the work week. Then it's on to annual leave, taking the actual annual leave, your load. When you're on leave, trying to allow yourself sort of to step away, especially for those of us who work virtually, finding ways to not allow that sense of work to encroach on our home time. And then, that goes on. Some people go on sabbaticals and retreats as well. There's more retreats coming up, and we've got a retreat that we're doing because we really want to carve out that space for people.
Yeah, fantastic. And actually that goes along with what the evidence says in burnout as well, that regular short breaks throughout the working day, but also throughout your weeks and months, is better and more protective than waiting for one long annual holiday every year.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, lovely. Okay, so as we start to round things up then, what 3 pieces of advice would you give my listeners who are perhaps burnt out and thinking about returning to work?
Wrote it down as we spoke earlier. So I think we've talked about them already, but I guess it's just summarizing some of the key themes. We've talked about loads, but I think some of the key themes are recognizing what's going on. So, what kind of is it burnout? Does it, what are you feeling? Is it this burnout we talked about at the beginning with these 3 criteria, or is it not that? And that's fine too. In many ways, it doesn't quite matter, but what matters is that you've noticed how you're feeling and you're getting, having those conversations and getting the help. So that's really important, because I didn't notice for a long time and then I got worse. So I think it is really important to have that insight into what's going on. The second thing, which is linked to that, and we talked about this, almost a thread that goes throughout a lot of what we've said, is this permission. We talked about guilt and then permission, and that permission is permission to know how you're feeling. Then it also is helpful when you come back and have that advocacy piece when you're returning to work. So it's like permission to notice how you're feeling, to work out what you need and give yourself permission to work that out. And then that kind of gives you a bit of courage to have those conversations with the manager. So I think, yeah. And the third thing would be the final thing was about taking pauses and having breaks. And I totally agree with you. Annual leave is great, but for sustaining ourselves, we need sustained breaks throughout the day, throughout the week, and little pockets so like I said, 3 months off is amazing, but actually a little day off here and there, or a short break here and there throughout a 12-month period is going to be more sustaining than hanging on for dear life and just really like just running on empty and then having a break. And that's not such a sustainable model.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much. Before we finish things up today, do you just want to briefly explain where people can find you and just tell us about this retreat that's coming up for you as well?
Well, I'd love to. Yeah. So you can find me at theworkingwelldoctor.com, and my email is katya@workingwelldoctor.com. And then, on social media, I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn. So Instagram is The Working Well Doctor, and LinkedIn is Dr. Katya Miles. I do a newsletter twice a month for these kind of ideas and themes. That's called Thrive While News. You can just drop me an email, go to my website to subscribe. We'd love to have you. And you get discounts for events and everything like that. It's very exciting. Retreat, we're really excited about this. It's a real life retreat. So that's a really fun thing to do now COVID is behind us. So it's on the 12th of May in a lovely farm in Oxfordshire with a lovely kind of nature. It's within nature, and it's just going to be a day. So in a day, we don't want to rush. We want to create that space. So it's about creating space as a small group of like-minded people. We're going to do some creative writing because it's really helpful, as we've talked about, one way to access this reflective space. We're going to do some mindfulness and some in nature. And we're going to do something on values and vision, which is, again, getting back to the themes we talked about just now about planning. What does it feel like for you, your future? It's going to be super fun. It's with a wonderful doctor called Jo Hacking and I. So if you're interested, come along. We'd love to see you. It's going to be, I'm excited already. I've done one of these before and it's really fun to go. So
yeah.
Join us 12th of May. Just find me on Instagram, or just go to The Working Well Doctor on Instagram, or email me at katya@theworkingwelldoctor.com and I'll send you all the information.
Lovely. We can also put that in the blurb for the show so that people can just click through directly if you've got a direct link.
Oh, yeah, that would be cool. And actually there's early bird discount until the 1st of May.
Fantastic. Yeah, it sounds great. And it's so nice to get back to doing things face to face and in real life, isn't it, after COVID? It feels like such a novelty, but that human connection is that shared experience is so important, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, though I'm an amazing person, I think a lot of the magic is in the group. You know, and the coming together as real humans, and in having that time away again. We talked about permission. It's on a Friday, so you kind of get that sense of being away. Hopefully then you ease into the weekend. That's really powerful. And I think a lot of people who've done these workshops before, these retreats before, there's a longer term shift that happens back to the stuff we just talked about what does your future career look like. So you go away for this day, hopefully have a lovely time, but actually you might come away with something longer term that will shift your perspective going forward.
Lovely. Oh, well, thank you so much for joining me today, Katya.
It's been super fun. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.